Think about your eyes. If they are blue, you are carrying something inside your body right now that fewer than 8 out of every 100 people on Earth possess. And scientists have discovered something about it that sounds almost too strange to be real. Every single blue-eyed person alive today, no matter their nationality, language, or continent, carries the exact same tiny piece of altered DNA. Not a similar mutation, the identical genetic change, letter for letter, in the exact same spot on the exact same chromosome. In 2008, a research team in Copenhagen confirmed something that should have been statistically impossible if blue eyes had appeared naturally, again and again, in different corners of the world the way most traits do. There was no scattering of independent origins. There was one origin, and only one. Somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, a single human being was born with a genetic accident that had never happened before in the history of our species. And that one accident is the reason your eyes, or the eyes of someone you love, look the way they do today. Before we go further, if hidden stories written inside human DNA fascinate you, stay with this video and consider subscribing. Because what you are about to hear rewrites almost everything most people assume about where blue eyes actually came from. Let's start with something that catches almost everyone off guard. Blue eyes are not actually blue. There is no blue pigment inside a human eye, none at all. What you are seeing is not paint sitting inside the iris. It is an optical illusion, the very same illusion that makes the sky appear blue, even though the atmosphere contains no blue substance floating above us. The iris, the colored ring around your pupil, normally contains a pigment called melanin, the same pigment responsible for the color of your skin and hair. People with brown eyes have dense concentrations of it. People with hazel or green eyes carry a moderate amount, and people with blue eyes have almost none. When there is very little melanin present, light entering the eye scatters off the fibers of the iris instead of being absorbed. And shorter wavelengths, the blue end of the spectrum, bounce back toward whoever is looking at you. Scientists call this Tyndall scattering, named after the physicist who first explained why the sky and distant mountains look blue through a haze. Your blue eyes exist because of an absence, not an addition, a lack of pigment combined with a simple trick of physics. Now here is where the story becomes genuinely strange. If blue eyes were simply a matter of low melanin appearing at random, you would expect them to pop up unpredictably in populations all over the globe. That is not what the genetic record shows. In 2008, Hans Eyberg at the University of Copenhagen published research that had quietly consumed more than a decade of his career. His team sequenced DNA from blue-eyed volunteers in Denmark, then expanded the study to blue-eyed individuals from Turkey and Jordan, populations separated by enormous geographic and cultural distance. What they found should not have been possible under ordinary evolutionary assumptions. Every blue-eyed participant, regardless of ancestry, carried the identical stretch of genetic code surrounding a tiny mutation near a gene called OCA2, sitting on chromosome 15. OCA2 controls how much melanin the body manufactures, including inside the iris. The mutation itself sat not inside OCA2 directly, but in a neighboring gene called HERC2, in a small regulatory region that functions like a dimmer switch, controlling how loudly OCA2 gets expressed. This switch does not shut pigment production off completely. It simply turns the dial down, just enough to strip away most of the brown coloring in the iris and allow light to scatter, producing that pale, almost translucent blue. If blue eyes had evolved independently in separate populations, each group would carry its own distinct version of the mutation, its own unique fingerprint. Instead, every blue-eyed person tested carried the same fingerprint, whether their ancestry traced to Scandinavia, the Levant, or Anatolia. There is only one explanation that fits. A single mutation appeared once inside one human being, sometime in that 6,000 to 10,000 year window, and every blue-eyed person walking the planet today descends from that one individual. So who was this person, and where did they actually live? For decades, the assumption seemed almost too obvious to question. Blue eyes reach their highest concentration today in the far north of Europe, in Estonia, Finland, Latvia, and Iceland, where more than half the population carries the trait. It felt natural to assume the mutation originated in that cold, pale-skinned north. But once researchers began sequencing DNA from genuinely ancient skeletons rather than only modern populations, that assumption collapsed almost immediately. The oldest human remains carrying this specific mutation were not unearthed in Scandinavia, Ireland, or Germany. They came from far to the east, along the northern edge of the Black Sea, sweeping across modern Ukraine and southern Russia, through the foothills of the Caucasus Mountains, and out into the grasslands of Central Asia. Archaeologists now call this vast corridor the Pontic-Caspian Steppe, and mounting evidence points to it as the true birthplace of blue eyes in our species. What makes this even harder to reconcile with modern assumptions is the physical appearance of these earliest carriers. They did not look like pale, light-haired northern Europeans. Consider Cheddar Man, a hunter-gatherer skeleton discovered in northern Spain and dated to roughly 7,000 years ago. Genetic analysis revealed that he carried the blue eye mutation paired with skin pigmentation as dark as many populations in sub-Saharan Africa today. He lived on European soil, yet his combination of features matched nothing we typically picture when we imagine ancient Europeans, a lineage present in Eurasia long before lighter-skinned farming populations migrated in from the Near East and gradually reshaped the continent's gene pool. An even more famous case comes from Britain itself. In 1903, a skeleton was discovered in Gough's Cave within Cheddar Gorge in Somerset, later nicknamed Cheddar Man. He lived roughly 10,000 years ago, one of the oldest nearly complete human skeletons ever found on British soil. In 2018, researchers at University College London and the Natural History Museum extracted DNA from his inner ear bone and built an astonishingly detailed facial reconstruction. The result stunned the public, though scientists involved noted it did not particularly surprise ancient DNA specialists who had already seen similar patterns elsewhere in Mesolithic Europe. Cheddar Man had dark, almost black skin, tightly curled dark hair, and strikingly pale blue eyes. He was not an ancestor of the blonde-haired Scandinavians, so often imagined when people picture ancient northern Europe. He belonged to a much older population of dark-skinned hunter-gatherers whose genetic roots stretched deep into the heart of Eurasia, long before the labels we use today, European, Asian, Northern, Southern, meant anything at all. Picture the moment this all began. Somewhere on those wide steppe grasslands, a single infant was born into a small hunter-gatherer band, with eyes unlike anyone else's in the group. We will never know whether that child was regarded as something wondrous, something unsettling, or simply something curious that faded from conversation within a season. We do not know a name, a face, or a single detail of a life story. What we do know, with remarkable genetic certainty, is that this individual survived into adulthood and had children, and that across the following centuries, generation folding into generation, that tiny mutation kept traveling. It moved as small bands mingled, intermarried, and pushed outward across the enormous open expanse of the Eurasian steppe. Here is a part of the story that rarely makes it into Western retellings. The descendants of these earliest blue-eyed people did not only drift westward into what became Europe, they also moved east, deep into the heart of Asia, crossing the Tian Shan Mountains, threading through the Tarim Basin, and reaching the deserts of what is now western China. The genetic fingerprints of that eastward migration are still visible today, thousands of kilometers from any European country. Travel into the high valleys of Tajikistan and up into the towering Pamir range that separates Central Asia from the Indian subcontinent, and you will meet people whose appearance regularly surprises outside visitors. Some villagers in the upper Pamirs carry blue eyes, light-colored hair, and facial structures that fit neither a typical European nor a typical East Asian mold. These are the Pamiri peoples, ancient communities who have lived in these mountains for thousands of years. Most Pamiris have brown eyes, but when blue eyes appear among them, genetic analysis shows they carry the same original signal that first appeared on the steppe, simply carried east instead of west. The same pattern shows up among the Wakhi people who live in the narrow mountain corridor where Tajikistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and China meet. It appears among some Hazara communities in central Afghanistan, whose ancestry blends ancient Iranian roots with later Mongol heritage. It also surfaces among Uyghur communities in Xinjiang, a Turkic-speaking population whose DNA reflects thousands of years of mixing between European, Central Asian, and East Asian lineages, especially in the southern oases surrounding the Tarim Basin, the very region where archaeologists have unearthed ancient mummies with strikingly European-looking features, including reddish or blonde hair, preserved by the region's brutally dry desert climate. One group in particular tends to catch people completely off guard. Deep in the remote valleys of the Hindu Kush mountains in northern Pakistan lives a small population called the Kalash. Only a few thousand remain today, but their genetics are extraordinary. Many have light skin, blonde or reddish hair, and pale blue or green eyes. They speak a language belonging to the Indo-European family and continue to practice pre-Islamic religious traditions passed down across countless generations. Genetic testing confirms a strong connection to the same ancient steppe populations responsible for spreading blue eyes across Europe. Local legend claims the Kalash descend from soldiers left behind by Alexander the Great. The genetic evidence tells a different, older story, tracing their lineage back nearly 4,000 years to the early migrations of Indo-Iranian peoples across Central Asia. The Kalash are not recent arrivals dropped into these mountains by a passing army. They are a living fragment of a far older world. Now, consider the Tarim mummies, among the most remarkable archaeological discoveries connected to this story. These well-preserved bodies, dating back roughly 4,000 years, were recovered from the arid Taklamakan Desert in what is today Western China. When researchers sequenced their full genomes in a landmark 2021 study, The results overturned decades of earlier assumptions. Many archaeologists had guessed these mummies represented recent migrants of European or Indo-European origin who had wandered unusually far from home. The genetic data told a different story. The Tarim individuals were a genetically isolated local population descended from a much older group of ancient North Eurasians, the same deep ancestral population that contributed heavily to the genetic makeup of both early Europeans and early Native Americans. They were not Europeans stranded in Asia. They were a local, long-isolated branch of a shared and far older story, one that predates the entire concept of Europe and Asia as separate categories. This single genetic thread links the Pamir Mountains, the Tarim Basin, the steppes of Kazakhstan, and the shores of the Black Sea into one enormous interconnected web of human ancestry. And blue eyes are woven directly through it. They were never a purely European trait later exported eastward, nor an Asian trait exported westward. They belonged to something older than either label, tracing back to a shared population whose descendants eventually gave rise to both. Let's return to the biology for a moment because the mechanism is worth understanding in more depth. The gene at the center of the story, OCA2, sits on chromosome 15 and produces a protein involved in melanin synthesis inside the iris, skin, and hair follicles. Under ordinary conditions, OCA2 drives a healthy, robust production of brown pigment. Sitting immediately adjacent is a regulatory switch within the neighboring HERC2 gene, and this switch determines exactly how active OCA2 becomes. Roughly 8,000 years ago, give or take, a single base pair changed within that regulatory switch, the genetic equivalent of a dimmer knob rather than the light bulb itself. That switch was turned down just enough. Less melanin reached the iris, and the tissue scattered incoming light rather than absorbing it, producing the pale blue color recognized worldwide today. This precision explains why blue eyes remain so genetically consistent across every population where they appear. The mutation was specific and statistically unlikely enough to occur twice in exactly the same way, so it never needed to reappear. It spread outward from a single starting point rather than evolving independently in different places. This naturally raises an obvious question. If blue eyes offer no clear survival advantage, no protection against disease, no benefit for surviving harsh climates, why did the mutation spread so successfully and persist for thousands of years instead of quietly disappearing? Researchers have debated this for decades without a single definitive answer. Some propose that blue eyes simply stood out visually within small, isolated populations, forming after the last ice age, making blue-eyed individuals more noticeable and more likely to attract partners, a form of sexual selection rather than survival-driven natural selection. Others argue the mutation hitchhiked alongside genuinely useful nearby genetic variants, spreading not because it was chosen for itself, but because it rode along with traits that did offer real advantages. Still others suspect plain genetic drift, the trait spreading largely through chance during the agricultural revolution, when population sizes were small enough for a neutral trait to spread through simple luck. Researchers may never settle on one explanation, but the outcome is not in dispute. The mutation spread generation after generation as people migrated, traded, and intermarried, eventually reaching nearly every corner of the Eurasian landmass. There is something else worth pausing on here. When this mutation first appeared, it existed inside exactly one person, one family, one small hunting and gathering group. But ancestry compounds in strange, exponential ways across long stretches of time. Anyone carrying even a trace of ancient steppe ancestry has some statistical chance of also carrying that original mutation, and that chance has multiplied across thousands of generations since. This helps explain why blue eyes became so concentrated in Northern Europe specifically. The mutation did not originate there. Populations already carrying the trait eventually settled there in large numbers, often within smaller isolated communities, where the gene became more concentrated over successive generations through genetic drift and founder effects. In regions where populations mixed more freely with outside groups, the trait became diluted across the wider gene pool, but it was never fully erased. It continues to surface unexpectedly in places that might initially seem surprising. Think for a moment about what it means for a single ancient mutation to eventually reach an estimated 300 to 400 million blue-eyed people alive today. Every one of them carries an unbroken chain of biological descent stretching back to that one original ancestor. If you traced your own family tree back 200 generations, roughly 4,000 to 5,000 years, the mathematics becomes genuinely strange. You would technically end up with more theoretical ancestral slots than there were actual living humans on Earth at that point in history. This means the same individuals appear repeatedly throughout your family tree, contributing through many separate branches rather than just one. That original blue-eyed ancestor is very likely one of those recurring figures, appearing not once, but thousands of times scattered across your own lineage. This is precisely why the mutation remains so genetically consistent even among populations separated by thousands of years and kilometers. This is why a grandmother in a remote Pamiri village might have eyes the color of a mountain lake. It's why a Uyghur child in Kashgar might carry eyes that would not look out of place in Scandinavia. It's why a young boy from a valley in Afghanistan might share the exact same eye color as a farmer living in rural Ireland, despite thousands of kilometers separating their families and no direct contact between their ancestors for millennia. None of this is coincidence, and none of it stems from recent contact with Europeans, colonial era mixing, or modern travel. These are genetic echoes, faint but remarkably persistent signals, passed down from a single distant ancestor whose descendants now stretch across the entire Eurasian landmass and well beyond it. Modern genetic research has pushed this story even further by analyzing thousands of ancient skeletons and mapping precisely how the blue eye mutation traveled across continents over thousands of years. One of the primary vehicles for this genetic spread was the Yamnaya culture, pastoralist communities who lived across the Pontic-Caspian Steppe, roughly 5,000 to 3,000 years before the Common Era. The Yamnaya were skilled herders who had domesticated horses and developed wheeled carts, innovations that granted them an unusually mobile way of life and allowed rapid expansion in multiple directions at once. Moving west, Yamnaya populations became major genetic contributors to nearly every modern European population, a finding confirmed repeatedly through large-scale ancient DNA studies over the past decade. Moving east, related steppe populations pushed deep into Central Asia and eventually reached the far western edges of what is now China, carrying their genes, elements of their language families, and their distinctive physical traits along with them wherever they settled and intermixed with local populations. This single migratory wave helps explain why traces of the blue-eye gene show up today in regions that initially seem completely disconnected from one another. Ancient steppe migrations helped shape the ancestry that later contributed to populations across the British Isles, the Iranian Plateau, and the Indian subcontinent, including groups later associated with Indo-Aryan language and culture. The Tarim Basin, the Pamir Mountains, the Caucasus region, the Balkans, and parts of the Levant all absorbed varying degrees of steppe ancestry over the past 5,000 years, and along with that ancestry came the same distinctive eye color that first appeared in a single child on the grasslands of ancient Eurasia. There is one more piece of this puzzle that often gets overlooked entirely. The Asian populations carrying the blue eye gene today are far from a minor historical footnote. Many of them descend from some of the most influential and formidable peoples the ancient world ever produced. The Scythians, who dominated the Central Asian steppe for well over 1,000 years, left behind elaborate burial sites across modern Kazakhstan and Mongolia, containing skeletons with light-colored eyes and reddish hair, along with extraordinarily preserved textiles and metalwork. The Tocharians built mysterious walled cities within the Tarim Basin that served as vital trading hubs along the earliest branches of what later became the Silk Road, and their surviving written records use a language surprisingly closely related to Latin and Celtic, despite being spoken thousands of kilometers to the east. There were also the Saka, the Masajte, and the Wusun, ancient steppe peoples who, to varying degrees, all carried elements of the same shared genetic inheritance passed down from common ancestors far to the west. The Tocharians deserve particular attention because their story is genuinely one of the strangest chapters in ancient history. They inhabited the Tarim Basin in what is now the Xinjiang region of China from roughly 2,000 years before the Common Era until the early medieval period. Their language survives in manuscripts written on birch bark and dried palm leaves, and when linguists finally deciphered these texts in the early 20th century, they uncovered an astonishing pattern. Tocharian belonged unmistakably to the Indo-European language family, yet it was more closely related grammatically and lexically to Celtic and Italic languages, the ancestors of modern Irish and Latin-derived tongues, than to any of its immediate geographic neighbors in Central or East Asia. How a population speaking a distinctly Western branch of the Indo-European family ended up living on the edge of China, thousands of kilometers from where that language family originally developed, remains one of the enduring puzzles of ancient migration. The most compelling explanation traces directly back to those same steppe ancestors who carried the blue eye mutation eastward so many thousands of years earlier. So if you have blue eyes, your family history is considerably more complicated and far more interconnected than you were likely ever taught. It is not simply European, and it is not simply Western. It stretches back through layers of migration and mixing that most people never stop to consider, reaching deep into the heart of Eurasia. It connects you to nomadic herders of the open steppe, to mountain communities scattered across the Pamirs, to ancient traders along the earliest Silk Road routes, and to hunter-gatherers who once roamed prehistoric Siberia and the Ice Age plains of Eastern Europe. In many ways, your eye color functions almost like a faded, weathered map, one that points just as strongly toward the east as it does toward the north, a quiet reminder that human history is far more shared, far more tangled, and far more interconnected than any single national or ethnic label could ever fully capture. There is something genuinely moving buried inside all of this, Every blue-eyed person alive today, regardless of where they were born, regardless of the language shaping their childhood, regardless of the culture that raised them, shares a common ancestor with every other blue-eyed person on the planet. Not in some vague, poetic, symbolic sense, but literally. A real person once lived, breathed, and walked across the earth roughly 8,000 years ago, somewhere near the edge of the Black Sea, or perhaps farther east across the open grasslands of Central Asia. In a very real, genetically demonstrable sense, that person is your ancestor across a few hundred generations, and they are simultaneously the ancestor of every other blue-eyed person you have ever crossed paths with in your entire life. Throughout much of ancient history, the color blue itself was treated as something rare, precious, and nearly sacred. Ancient Sumerian traders journeyed enormous distances to import lapis lazuli from mountain mines in what is now Afghanistan, hauling the deep blue stone all the way back to Mesopotamia at tremendous cost and effort. Egyptian artisans later ground the same stone into pigment used to paint the eyes of their gods and pharaohs. Remarkably, many ancient languages, including early forms of Greek, apparently lacked a distinct, dedicated word for the color blue altogether, describing the sea and sky instead through comparisons to wine or bronze. Against that kind of cultural backdrop, encountering another human being with naturally blue eyes must have felt almost supernatural to the people who first witnessed it, an unexplainable rarity walking around in plain daylight. So the next time you happen to notice a pair of blue eyes anywhere in the world, understand that you are looking at a living fragment of that ancient story, a story that began in a place most history books forget to even mention, a story connecting remote mountain villages in the Pamirs to the rugged coastlines of Ireland, the sun-scorched deserts of the Tarim Basin to the icy fjords of Norway, and the windswept steppes of Kazakhstan to quiet farming villages tucked into the hills of Wales. It is a story written directly into human DNA, quietly passed down across countless generations, somehow surviving wars, famines, empires, and migrations that erased entire civilizations from the historical record entirely. Blue eyes are not merely a physical feature. They are a genuine fragment of ancient history, still alive and functioning inside real people walking around today. A genetic signature left behind by an ancestor whose face none of us will ever actually see or know. And it stands as a powerful reminder that the people of the deep past are not truly gone at all. They continue living on, quietly, in the smallest and most personal details of the people who remain here today. If this story resonated with you, let us know in the comments where your family comes from and what eye color has been passed down through your own family line. We would genuinely love to hear it. And if you enjoy uncovering the hidden ancestry written directly into human DNA, the kind of history your school textbooks somehow always manage to skip, subscribe, and stay close, because there are many more stories exactly like this one still waiting to be told. Thank you for watching. And until next time, keep looking closer, keep asking harder questions, and keep listening carefully to what the deep past still has to tell us.